Good evening and welcome to the Capitol Report on Entity Television. I'm Steve Lance, and here's a look at what's coming up. The White House warning of the consequence of a potential ceasefire in Gaza, what Israel's vowing to do next, and what the Biden administration says about a potential mass evacuation of U.S. citizens. The third time was not the charm. Republicans electing a new Speaker nominee, GOP Whip Tom Emmer, only to go back to square one hours later. Where are they now? So what happens if there's a ceasefire in Gaza? The White House today weighing in as the Pentagon revealing the number of attacks against U.S. troops in the Middle East. Joining us now live is NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao. Good evening, Iris. So what's the White House's current stance as some protesters in the U.S. are calling for ceasefire?
Good evening to you, Steve. So in addition to some protesters here apparently in the U.S., the UN Secretary General today also called for what he called an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. However, the White House today made its point clear that while there will be casualties in this war, a ceasefire right now will only benefit Hamas. Watch.
A ceasefire right now really only benefits Hamas. This is war. It is combat. It is bloody. It is ugly, and it's going to be messy. And innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward. I wish I could tell you something different. I wish that wasn't going to happen, but it is going to happen.
But the White House says that a humanitarian pause, which is different from a general ceasefire, should be considered in order to allow more aid to get into Gaza, a process that President Biden today said was going too slow and not fast enough. Meanwhile, the administration also confirmed today that there are now 33 Americans killed by Hamas and that 10 Americans remain missing, with an unknown number of them believed to have been taken hostage by Hamas. Steve.
So, Iris, what about those American citizens still there? Israel said today that its military is now facing the next stage of the war as it aims to crush Hamas. How is the administration assisting American citizens in that region?
So like you said, Steve, the situation in the Middle East right now is changing very fast, with a potential ground offensive pending in Gaza. And now there are other forces involved. For example, the Pentagon today saying that there have been now at least 13 attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria in the past week alone. But the White House today is saying that there has not been any direct orders given for any execution of mass evacuation of American citizens in the Middle East. But it did say that it will be imprudent and irresponsible to not have any plans for it. Steve.
NTD's Iris Tao reporting from the White House. Iris, thank you. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken today addressing the United Nations Security Council. The speech coming amid international fears that multiple countries could be dragged into a Mideast war, possibly involving the United States and Iran.
The United States does not seek conflict with Iran. We do not want this war to widen. But if Iran or its proxies attack U.S. personnel anywhere, make no mistake, we will defend our people, we will defend our security swiftly and decisively.
Just this week, Iranian-backed groups attacked American bases in the Middle East, and the U.S. is taking new steps to protect its troops, sending warships and fighter aircraft into that region. Blinken saying UN Security Council members have a responsibility to prevent the conflict from spreading. Meanwhile, later this week, Blinken is set to meet with China's top diplomat Wang Yi in Washington. Beijing has refused to explicitly condemn Hamas, and the White House says the administration will bring up the challenges it has with Beijing in the coming meetings. Israel's military today saying it's ready to enter the next stage of the war. It's just waiting for instructions. Many expected a ground invasion of Gaza to happen much sooner. Meanwhile, the U.S. is telling Israel to delay the invasion until all hostages are released. To learn more about these complex issues, we have William Ruger, president of the American Institute for Economic Research, who is also an officer in the United States Navy Reserves. William Ruger, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, William, with regard to the U.S. suggesting to Israel to delay the ground invasion, do you agree with this approach, and what might be the reasons they're suggesting to do so?
Well, Israel needs to secure itself given its strategic context, especially after those horrific attacks. And so really the discussion about what Israel should do is properly for Israelis. That being said, the United States is obviously an important stakeholder in the Middle East and has its own interests to bear. And so you can understand why the United States would want to have an impact on how Israel is deciding what to do next, particularly given the fact that the United States has an interest in preventing this from becoming a wider war that the United States could be drawn into.
Exactly. To your point, reports are that Israeli military officials not happy with this approach and would like to press forward. And they're actually upset with Prime Minister Netanyahu for continuing to hold off. Does this complicate things for Israel? And how much so?
Well, look, Israeli politics is always going to be complicated by the relationship with the United States. The United States is such an important partner of Israel, and therefore it has to consider American voices on this. That being said, at a certain point, the ability of the United States to determine Israeli policy is going to be somewhat limited. And again, this is not surprising, right? The United States has a set of national interests. Israel has a set of national interests. A lot of times those things are overlapping, but not always. And so you can see tensions in the relationship developing. That being said, the relationship is still quite strong.
As you mentioned, Israel and the United States have their own set of interests. I would say President Biden's focus right now is the U.S. hostages that are still in possession of Hamas. Given the current state of play, how likely is it that a comprehensive hostage release deal can be reached between Israel and Hamas and the U.S.?
Yeah, again, that's very difficult to say. Obviously, Hamas taking these hostages thought that it had an advantage in doing so, despite the fact that this would, really be have a negative impact on the international outlook towards Hamas, and rightly so. So I don't think that they're going to give them back without something serious in return. And the question is will the United States, will Israel really want to give that? Again, I think it's just terrible that you see hostages being taken. Innocent non-combatant civilians should not be targets of political activity in this way. But you see it being something that Hamas believes will secure its interests. But one thing that's important to understand is that research on the use or targeting of innocent non-combatants shows that it's actually strategically imprudent, right? So it's not only is it morally foolish, but it doesn't generally work. Terrorism that targets specifically innocent non-combatants is a failure, generally speaking. And so it's actually quite unwise. And so I hope that Hamas will return these hostages and stop targeting innocent non-combatants.
So, William, last question here. There's talk right now of Gaza running out of fuel. This is in anticipation of a potential ground invasion. How does this factor into Hamas's strategy, would you say, and how they're calculating their next move?
Yeah, this is not a fuel-intensive military force in Gaza, right? This is not the kind of army that you see in your kind of stereotypical World War I, World War II, Vietnam War scenario, right? This is a ground offensive by Israel is going to have to be a block-by-block, building-by-building fight against, individuals in that urban conflict zone. And so it's really a question about what type of small arms would be used by Hamas as opposed to a kind of war machine that needs a lot of fuel like you see right now, say, in Ukraine and Russia, and they're fighting.
William Ruger, really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you very much.
House Republicans spent all day choosing their third Speaker nominee, current GOP Whip Tom Emmer. But it's looking like this was the shortest run of all. NTD's Melina Wisecup joins us now live from Capitol Hill with some updates. So, Melina, tell us more about what's happening with Emmer.
Yeah, Steve, you have it completely right. This is the shortest lifespan that we've seen for a speaker nominee during this entire 3-week search for a speaker. They spent all morning, like you mentioned, sifting through those 8 candidates that they started with to finally elect Tom Emmer as their speaker designee, only to have him hours later withdraw from this race. Now, he withdrew after not only upwards of 20 members were adamantly opposing him, saying they would never support him on the House floor, but more interestingly enough, he also withdrew just moments after the former president got involved We'll read you what former President Trump had to say about the possibility of having Emmer as the speaker. He said, voting for a globalist rhino like Tom Emmer would be a tragic mistake. Now, keep in mind, this is also after Tom Emmer tried to garner support from former President Trump with a phone call earlier this week. Obviously, that did not work at all. And what's interesting about Trump weighing in on this is that he thought it was so important to even take time out of a press gavel that he was having outside of a court when they had a break to comment on it. We'll show you what Trump had to say along with what members were also telling me about Emmer as a speaker. Take a look.
Tom Emmer, it looks like he's finished. Looks like he's finished. He was not a supporter, he was a rhino, and it looks like he's finished, but we'll see.
I can't go along with putting one of the most moderate members of the entire Republican conference in the speaker's chair. That betrays the conservative values that I came here to fight for.
When people cease to come together as a majority, it's frustrating.
Because you can always find something then. I mean, if 98% of the time you agree, that's a lot. So hopefully people can see it that way rather than the 1 or 2% that they disagree.
Now, before the former president weighed in, we were already seeing that strong opposition, like I mentioned, from upwards of 20 members. Some members were saying they were concerned with Tom Emmer's voting record. We talked about this a bit yesterday. He voted for things like same-sex marriage last year. He supported the continuing resolution that got Speaker McCarthy ousted in the first place. He also supports Ukraine aid. So we knew all of this would be an issue, but it's just surprising how quickly that he did withdraw from this race. Steve?
So, Melina, with all that said, where does that ultimately leave us as far as the House seating a speaker at some point this week?
Well, it's looking like a long shot at this point. Republicans are once again back behind closed doors where they've been all day and frankly where they've been for the most part of the past 3 weeks, trying to sort out what their next steps are here. But essentially they're headed back to the drawing board, going for their fourth nominee. Hopefully that one sticks. They're going to try for it. But we'll see ultimately where all of this leaves us. Now, the one positive thing about Emmer dropping out so quickly is the fact that we didn't have to wait through multiple rounds of floor voting to see whether or not he could get the votes. Instead, the Republicans are just going to move on to someone else. Steve, back to you.
Well, besides it being chaotic, it is historic, and we appreciate you tracking everything for us, Melina. Thank you. Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.